Samuel Evans adjusted the crooked sign above the entrance of his cafe for the third time that morning. The humid air was heavy, a familiar weight pressing on him as he watched townsfolk passing by, their glances furtive and cold. Samuel, a robust man nearing 40, had worked tirelessly to transform the small building into a welcoming place, yet customers remained scarce. Inside the cafe, warm, freshly brewed coffee filled the air with a comforting aroma, mingling with the subtle scent of freshly baked pastries. Yet most tables stood empty. Samuel wiped the counters methodically, eyes glancing to the street through the broad windows, hoping to see a friendly face. Instead, his gaze caught Frank Wilson, a 45-year-old city official whose stance towards Samuel had never been friendly. Frank entered without knocking, his eyes immediately scanning the empty tables with a faint smirk. "Good morning, Frank," Samuel greeted, his voice steady yet cautious. Frank ignored the greeting and strolled around slowly, examining every corner of the cafe with exaggerated interest. He stopped at a window, touched its frame, inspecting his fingers theatrically. "Samuel," he finally spoke, turning sharply. "There's talk at City Hall. Some folks aren't comfortable with your cafe being right here downtown. They say it doesn't quite fit the image we want for our main street." Samuel felt his heart tighten. He kept his voice even, careful not to reveal anger or fear. "I meet all the regulations, Frank. You know that." Frank smiled coldly, shrugging with practiced nonchalance. "Maybe it's not just about regulations. Maybe it's about fitting in." Samuel clenched his fists behind the counter. The silence stretched between them, thickening the air. Outside, Emily Harris, the 28-year-old teacher from the local school, paused briefly at the window, noticing the tension inside. Their eyes met for a moment. Samuel's glance softened, appreciating her quiet solidarity before she moved on. Frank followed his gaze, noticing the teacher as well. He laughed lightly, shaking his head. "Careful who you ally yourself with, Samuel. Might hurt more than it helps." He exited as abruptly as he'd arrived, leaving Samuel standing rigidly behind the counter. His cafe felt emptier now, quieter somehow. Samuel understood clearly the veiled threat. He knew his cafe was more than just a business. It was his dream, his small piece of dignity and pride, fiercely carved out against the current of subtle hostility that had marked his entire life. As the afternoon progressed, Samuel had a few customers. A young construction worker named Joel Baker came by, grabbing coffee quickly between shifts, offering a tired yet sincere smile. Jessica Ford, the young waitress from the diner down the street, stopped by briefly, her mixed heritage often making her Samuel's silent ally. Yet despite these small acts of solidarity, Samuel's mind remained occupied by Frank's words. He knew the danger was not just in explicit hostility, but in the quiet, collective indifference of the community around him. His cafe stood alone, a quiet challenge to an unspoken yet powerful rule. That evening, Samuel locked the cafe doors slowly, lingering outside under the flickering street lamp. Downtown was quiet now, bathed in the orange glow of twilight. Samuel's reflection stared back at him from the cafe's window, illuminated by the gentle glow of streetlights. His face tired, his shoulders burdened by a lifetime of quietly enduring injustice. Yet his gaze hardened with determination. He wouldn't abandon his dream, despite knowing clearly the odds against him. Samuel turned away, heading home through quiet streets, feeling the quiet weight of his town's prejudice in every step. Yet tonight, under the quiet stars above, his resolve to resist and remain firm burned brighter than ever. Emily Harris stood at the front of her brightly decorated classroom, her blue eyes softly scanning the 25 faces of her young adult students. At 28 years old, Emily was one of the youngest teachers at Jefferson High School, her passion for education glowing through every word and gesture. Her topic today, however, made her nervous: racial injustice and its quiet persistence in their small southern town. "Today we're going to discuss something very important," she began gently, leaning slightly forward as if inviting their trust. "We're going to talk about racism." Instantly, the room tightened with tension. Some students shifted uncomfortably. Others exchanged quick, uneasy glances. Emily took a steadying breath, continuing cautiously. "I know it might be uncomfortable to talk about, but discomfort often means we're facing something real." At the back, Michael Thompson, a tall 19-year-old whose father was an influential local businessman, folded his arms defensively. "What's the point, Miss Harris?" Michael's voice was firm, tinged with faint hostility. "This isn't exactly a problem anymore, is it?" Emily paused, recognizing the quiet resistance already spreading through the classroom. "Actually," she replied calmly, "that's exactly why it's important. Sometimes the worst problems are those we pretend don't exist. She stepped toward the whiteboard, writing the word prejudice in clear, neat handwriting. Have any of you witnessed prejudice right here in our town? Silence stretched painfully. Emily glanced around, trying to catch someone's eye. Finally, Jessica Ford, the thoughtful young waitress who balanced high school classes with evening shifts, timidly raised her hand. Jessica? Emily nodded encouragingly. Jessica hesitated slightly before speaking. My mother is black and my father is white. Sometimes customers at the diner look at me strangely, or they make little comments, things they probably don't even realize are hurtful. Michael snorted dismissively, whispering something inaudible to his friends. Emily shot him a warning glance, her patience thinning. Jessica makes an important point, Emily interjected firmly. Prejudice can be subtle. It can be in small words, quiet attitudes, or simply how someone is treated day to day. The bell interrupted them, and a wave of relief washed visibly over the students. They rose quickly, voices rising in chatter, eager to escape the discomfort of Emily's lesson. Emily stood quietly at her desk, disappointment filling her chest. She'd hoped for more openness, a chance to confront deeply embedded beliefs. Instead, she'd hit a wall of silent resistance. Later that afternoon, Emily sat alone in the teacher's lounge, grading papers. The door creaked open, and Helen Collins, the senior English teacher, entered, eyes stern behind thick glasses. Emily, Helen began cautiously, sitting across from her. Some parents called the principal today. They aren't happy with your lesson. Emily's pen halted mid-mark, tension crawling up her spine. Why? Helen sighed heavily, her gaze softening slightly. They feel you're stirring unnecessary tension. They say Jefferson High isn't the place for political lectures. Emily clenched her jaw, frustration building. It wasn't political. It's about basic decency and understanding. Helen touched her hand gently, attempting to comfort. Just be careful, Emily. You're still new here. It's difficult to challenge the way people see things. As Helen left, Emily sat quietly, her confidence shaken. Perhaps her attempts at addressing racism openly had only deepened existing divides. Yet, looking out the window toward Samuel's café in the distance, she remembered the determined look Samuel had earlier that day. The resolve she saw in his eyes strengthened her own. Later, walking home through the quiet streets, Emily passed the construction site managed by Carl Brooks. She briefly noticed Joel Baker, the young worker who had visited Samuel's café, silently enduring Carl's harsh comments. Her heart sank at the familiarity of injustice, so seamlessly woven into their town's fabric. At home, Emily sat at her kitchen table, illuminated softly by the yellow glow of a single lamp. She opened her laptop, beginning to plan tomorrow's lesson. Hesitating for a moment, she remembered Helen's caution, Michael's dismissiveness, and the parents' complaints. Yet she couldn't silence the voice inside, compelling her to continue. She typed with growing certainty, determined not to retreat into silence. Tomorrow she would try again, quieter perhaps, but no less determined. Across town, Samuel sat in his small apartment, contemplating the same quiet courage, unaware of Emily's parallel struggle. Together, without even knowing it, they shared the same quiet, steadfast resolve, facing the invisible lines drawn clearly and deeply through their lives. Joel Baker wiped sweat from his forehead, squinting against the blistering midday sun. At 22, he carried himself with the cautious dignity of someone far older, his broad shoulders bearing burdens heavier than the wooden beams he lifted each day at Brooks Construction. Around him, hammers echoed sharply, blending into a rhythm that numbed the thoughts but couldn't mask his quiet anger. Carl Brooks stood nearby, observing the workers with a critical gaze, his pale skin reddening in the heat. Carl, a man in his 50s, rarely smiled and never hid his prejudices. His eyes narrowed each time they fell on Joel, his words sharper, his demands harsher. "Hey, Baker!" Carl shouted suddenly, his voice harsh above the clamor. "Pick up the pace. I don't pay you to slack off." Joel tightened his grip silently, lifting another heavy plank onto his shoulder. He felt the sting of Carl's disdainful tone, familiar yet no less painful. He noticed several co-workers glancing away, their discomfort evident but unspoken. No one dared challenge Carl, whose construction firm was one of the few reliable employers in their small town. Later, as Joel rested briefly in the shade during lunch, his friend Marcus, another worker, approached cautiously, sitting beside him. "You good, man?" Marcus asked softly, eyes worried. "Carl's been on your case all week." Joel shrugged, forcing calm into his voice. I'm used to it. Marcus shook his head bitterly. It ain't right. You ever think about speaking up? Joel sighed heavily, eyes distant. Who'd listen? Brooks owns half this town. Their conversation stopped abruptly as Carl appeared again, his shadow looming over them like a silent threat. Lunch ended 5 minutes ago, Carl growled, eyes fixed angrily on Joel. Get back to work, or find somewhere else to waste time. Joel rose quietly, not meeting Carl's eyes, returning to work with Marcus trailing silently behind. Anger simmered beneath Joel's carefully controlled movements, but survival demanded silence, patience, endurance. The afternoon passed slowly, shadows lengthening as the sun sank lower. Joel was storing equipment when Carl approached again, this time flanked by 2 other supervisors. Joel, we're missing some equipment, Carl said loudly, his tone accusatory. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you? Joel stiffened, feeling the eyes of coworkers turn towards him. A cold, familiar dread pooled in his stomach. No, sir, Joel replied carefully. I haven't seen anything. Carl snorted, stepping closer. Funny how things go missing around here, isn't it? Always near you. Joel felt anger rising dangerously, his fists clenching involuntarily. I've never stolen anything, he said, voice tight. Carl leaned closer, lowering his voice menacingly. People like you always say that. Maybe it's better you find somewhere else to work. Joel stared at the ground, forcing down his rage. He understood Carl's game, forcing him out quietly, no fuss, no evidence, just suspicion, prejudice, and power. He knew protesting would change nothing. Carl's influence ran too deep. Without responding, Joel turned away, grabbing his jacket roughly. The other workers stood quietly, eyes avoiding his, uncomfortable witnesses who preferred silence to solidarity. He left the site without looking back, humiliation and anger pressing hard against his chest. He walked slowly through the darkening streets, stopping eventually at Samuel's café, whose lights still glowed warmly in the gathering dusk. Samuel, about to close for the night, noticed Joel's troubled expression and motioned for him to enter. You look like you had a rough day, Samuel said softly, pouring coffee without being asked. Joel sank heavily into a chair, sighing deeply. Carl accused me of stealing, told me not to come back. Samuel's expression darkened, understanding without needing more explanation. He'd heard similar stories countless times. I'm sorry, Joel. You deserve better than that. Joel shook his head, voice quiet yet filled with bitter resignation. It's always the same. No one stands up to men like him. We're invisible unless they need someone to blame. Samuel regarded him solemnly, choosing his words carefully. You're not invisible, Joel. None of us are. It's just easier for people not to see. Joel considered Samuel's words silently, feeling a quiet connection of shared struggle. For a moment, sitting in the humble café, he allowed himself to feel a brief comfort, finding strength in their unspoken bond. As Joel stepped out into the night, streetlights cast pale circles onto the pavement. The injustice still burned sharply, but he felt slightly lighter, knowing he wasn't entirely alone. Walking home, Joel passed the school, seeing Emily Harris still working late, the glow from her classroom window warm in the darkness. It reminded him there were others quietly resisting, fighting their own battles against the same invisible enemy. Joel's steps grew steadier, his shoulders rising slightly in defiance. He knew Carl might have power, but dignity was something he refused to surrender. Tomorrow would come, bringing new uncertainties, but tonight he felt stronger. Not free from pain, but no longer invisible. Maria Lopez quietly pushed her cleaning cart down the narrow hallways of Parkside Apartments, a neat building where polished floors and bright windows concealed less welcoming truths. At 30 years old, Maria had long become accustomed to feeling unseen. Her presence was marked by the faint scent of lemon cleaner, the rustling sound of trash bags, and silent downward glances from the residents she served daily. Today, however, something felt different. The hallway seemed heavier, colder, though the sunlight poured brightly through the tall windows. As she approached apartment number 12, Maria paused briefly, gathering her composure before knocking gently on the door. Eleanor White, a stern-faced resident nearing 70, opened the door cautiously, her sharp gaze immediately narrowing as she saw Maria. You're late today, Mrs. White snapped impatiently, stepping aside without further greeting. I apologize, Mrs. White, Maria answered quietly, her voice gentle but firm. I had many tasks today. Mrs. White folded her arms tightly, watching Maria critically as she began cleaning the small, neatly arranged apartment. Every movement Maria made seemed magnified under Mrs. White's cold scrutiny. Maria felt the discomfort keenly but said nothing, her silence a practiced shield against daily humiliation. As Maria carefully dusted the shelves, Mrs. White's voice pierced the quiet once more. "I noticed my necklace was missing yesterday, Maria. It was right there, on that dresser. You were the only one here." Maria froze, heart sinking instantly. Turning slowly, she faced Mrs. White's accusing eyes. "I did not take it, Mrs. White." Mrs. White raised an eyebrow skeptically. "Who else could it have been?" Maria hesitated, the accusations stinging deeply. "Please check again, ma'am. Perhaps you placed it somewhere else," Mrs. White sighed irritably. "Don't tell me what I might have done. It's your word against mine, and we both know what that means." Maria's face flushed painfully at the clear implication. She lowered her eyes, resuming her cleaning in silence, heart heavy with bitterness. She knew her innocence meant little here. In these halls, suspicion and prejudice lingered openly behind polite smiles and clean carpets. Later that afternoon, Maria sat alone in the small basement room reserved for building staff, feeling weary and humiliated. Her quiet thoughts were interrupted by a gentle knock. Opening the door, she saw Annette Hayes, a young mother who had just moved into the building's lower floor. Annette's eyes, kind and empathetic, offered Maria silent reassurance. "I overheard Mrs. White accusing you," Annette said gently. "I wanted you to know. I believe you. I know what it's like to be judged before anyone knows you." Maria's eyes filled slightly, touched by unexpected kindness. "Thank you, Annette. Your words mean more than you know." Annette smiled softly before leaving, her brief visit a small beacon of hope in Maria's darkening day. Yet the accusation weighed heavily upon Maria as she finished her shift. Gathering her belongings, she quietly walked toward the building exit. Near the entrance, she heard voices whispering sharply. Pausing cautiously behind a half-open door, Maria recognized Mrs. White speaking heatedly to Frank Wilson, the city official who frequented the apartments. "We can't have people like her working here," Mrs. White complained indignantly. "We pay enough to have someone trustworthy." Frank sighed impatiently. "We'll take care of it. Don't worry." Maria's breath caught painfully in her throat. Silently, she stepped away, slipping unnoticed into the street. Fear mingled sharply with hurt as she hurried away from the building, shame and anger tangled together. In the gathering dusk, Maria found herself near Samuel's café, its lights glowing gently against the darkening sky. She hesitated briefly, then slowly entered. Samuel looked up, his warm smile fading slightly at the visible distress on her face. "Are you okay, Maria?" he asked gently, already pouring her coffee. Maria shook her head softly, sitting down wearily. "They accused me of stealing today, Samuel. Mrs. White lost her necklace and blamed me immediately. And Mr. Wilson, he promised he'd handle it. I think they'll fire me." Samuel's face tightened with frustration, the injustice painfully familiar. "I'm sorry, Maria. This happens too often." Maria nodded sadly, sipping the warm coffee. "Sometimes I think nothing will change here. I'm always an outsider." "You're not alone, Maria," Samuel assured her quietly. "We all feel that way, but at least we have each other. They can't take away our dignity." Maria smiled faintly, comforted by his quiet strength. She thanked Samuel softly and headed out into the cool night, the moon above glowing gently, unaware of the troubles beneath it. Walking slowly home, Maria reflected quietly, her spirit bruised yet not broken. Passing by Jefferson High School, she noticed Emily Harris still at work in her brightly lit classroom. Seeing the teacher's dedication reminded Maria that quiet resistance lived in their small town, stronger than it appeared at first glance. She continued homeward, feeling less isolated. Tomorrow might bring more struggles, but tonight, she felt quietly determined, inspired by the solidarity of those quietly fighting similar battles. It was enough, for now, to keep her dignity intact beneath the weight of daily injustice. Jessica Ford sat quietly at her kitchen table, fingers trembling slightly as she held the thin envelope from the university. At 20 years old, her dreams had always extended far beyond the borders of their small southern town. The envelope felt impossibly heavy, her future resting within its delicate paper folds. Her mother, Caroline, stood anxiously nearby, her gentle eyes full of cautious hope. "Go ahead, honey," she encouraged softly. "You earned this." Jessica took a deep breath, opening the envelope carefully. Her heart sank immediately as she read the short, formal rejection. Her eyes blurred, the words, "We regret to inform you," etched painfully in her mind. "It's a rejection," she whispered, voice tight with disappointment. Caroline embraced her gently, murmuring comfort Jessica barely heard. The rejection felt unfair, not just because she'd worked tirelessly, maintaining top grades despite late shifts at the diner, but because she knew she'd met every requirement. Something deeper gnawed at her heart. Jessica remembered clearly the whispers she'd overheard weeks before, rumors about preferential acceptance of others who were less qualified but better connected. Later that evening, Jessica arrived at the diner for her shift, the rejection letter heavy in her bag. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as she tied her apron quietly, trying to hide her sadness behind practiced professionalism. The diner was busier than usual, filled with familiar faces from town. Among them was Michael Thompson, the young man from her high school class whose father held considerable sway in local circles. He sat confidently at a table, boasting loudly to his friends. Jessica approached slowly, notebook ready. Michael glanced up, smiling casually, unaware, or perhaps uncaring, of her discomfort. "Hey Jessica, did you hear? I got accepted into state. My dad made a few calls and got me in." Jessica's grip tightened imperceptibly around her pencil. "Congratulations," she forced herself to reply calmly, though bitterness rose sharply in her chest. Michael's casual admission burned fiercely. The unfairness was no longer just a suspicion. It was openly confirmed, humiliatingly casual. Throughout her shift, Jessica felt her dreams slipping further away with each passing hour, as customers came and went, oblivious to her silent pain. Near closing time, Samuel Evans quietly entered the diner, his presence a comforting familiarity. He immediately noticed Jessica's troubled expression, waiting patiently at the counter until she approached. "Are you all right, Jessica?" Samuel asked gently, concern clear in his warm gaze. She shook her head slowly, her voice quiet but sharp with frustration. "I didn't get into the university. They chose someone else, a student whose father had influence." Samuel nodded slowly, understanding without needing further explanation. "I'm truly sorry. It isn't fair." Jessica sighed deeply, grateful for the empathy in Samuel's eyes. "I always believed that if I worked hard enough, nothing else would matter. But maybe that was just naive." Samuel leaned closer slightly, his voice firm but compassionate. "No, Jessica. Your dreams are valid. Their unfairness doesn't erase your worth or your efforts. It reflects their weaknesses, not yours." Jessica felt tears rising quietly, grateful for Samuel's steady reassurance. Before he left, Samuel gently encouraged her not to surrender her dreams, offering quiet solidarity in her struggle. On her way home, Jessica passed by Jefferson High, the school now dark except for Emily Harris's classroom, still illuminated softly. Pausing briefly, Jessica watched Emily through the window, noticing the teacher's quiet determination as she prepared lessons even in late hours. Emily's resilience quietly inspired Jessica, reminding her that strength often came quietly, behind closed doors, unnoticed yet powerful. Walking further, Jessica encountered Maria Lopez, who was just leaving Parkside Apartments, clearly weary from her long day. The two women exchanged brief nods, silently recognizing the mutual burdens they carried. In that fleeting moment, Jessica felt a stronger connection with Maria, both of them quietly resisting the invisible barriers placed before them. At home later that night, Jessica sat alone, holding her rejection letter once more. Slowly, her disappointment shifted into quiet resolve. She might be denied entrance into one university, but not even the unfairness she'd encountered could destroy her ambition entirely. Samuel's words echoed quietly, strengthening her determination. Her dreams had not diminished, they had merely shifted, sharpened by adversity. Jessica knew tomorrow would bring fresh challenges, but she resolved to continue quietly fighting, refusing to allow prejudice or favoritism to define her future. Though quiet, her strength was powerful, her ambition resilient in the face of injustice. Tonight, beneath the silence of her small, modest home, she quietly reclaimed her dream. Thomas Reed, at 35, had spent nearly a decade as a police officer in this small southern town. Tall, broad-shouldered, and always calm, he was widely respected yet quietly troubled. Each day he wore his badge proudly, yet beneath it rested an unease he'd long kept hidden. Today had started like any other, patrolling familiar streets, exchanging brief nods with residents who saw him as a symbol of order. His partner, Officer Brian Coleman, rode beside him, younger by a few years, his manner casual yet edged with arrogance that often unsettled Thomas. Late that afternoon they received a call. a minor disturbance at Mercy Hospital. Arriving quickly, Thomas recognized Annette Hayes, a young, soft-spoken woman known throughout the community. Annette stood near the reception area, visibly distressed, holding tightly to her young child who cried quietly against her shoulder. "What's going on?" Brian demanded sharply, approaching Annette abruptly. Annette spoke hurriedly, her voice strained with anxiety. "My daughter's sick. We've been waiting hours. I asked about the delay and they told me I was causing trouble." Brian's gaze hardened impatiently. "You need to calm down, ma'am. You're upsetting other patients." Thomas watched silently, feeling increasingly uneasy at Brian's abrasive manner. Annette's voice trembled slightly, frustration and exhaustion evident. "I'm not causing trouble. I'm just trying to get help for my child." Brian stepped closer, his voice lowering threateningly. "You either quiet down or I'll have to remove you." Annette's eyes filled with tears, humiliation and anger clear on her face. Thomas felt his heart tighten painfully as other patients turned away uncomfortably, pretending not to notice the injustice unfolding before them. "Brian," Thomas finally interjected gently, stepping forward cautiously, trying to diffuse the growing tension. "Maybe we can handle this differently?" Brian glanced sharply at Thomas, irritated. "I've got this, Reed. Don't undermine me." Thomas hesitated, painfully aware that every second of silence was complicit. He looked again at Annette, who now stared at him pleadingly, hoping for understanding, help, something he could not offer openly without risking consequences he feared deeply. Ultimately, Thomas remained silent, feeling ashamed as Brian ordered Annette outside roughly, her humiliation clear, his partner's prejudice starkly visible yet quietly tolerated. That evening, after his shift ended, Thomas drove home silently, thoughts heavy with self-disgust. The incident replayed repeatedly in his mind, revealing clearly how deeply injustice had rooted itself even within him. Pulling into his driveway, he felt a growing resolve. He needed to confront this reality, if not publicly yet, at least privately. Inside, sitting quietly across the table, Thomas faced his wife, Lauren. He described the incident at the hospital honestly, admitting his failure to intervene. Lauren listened silently, her expression solemn yet understanding. When he finished, she spoke softly yet firmly. "You saw something wrong, Thomas. You can't change everything, but you have a responsibility to speak up. Your silence is louder than you think." Her words cut deeply, yet Thomas knew their truth. Quietly reflecting, he decided to walk outside for air, needing clarity amid the turmoil within. His footsteps led him downtown, past Samuel's café, its soft lights glowing warmly despite being closed for the evening. He paused, noticing Samuel sitting inside, quietly working alone. Samuel glanced up briefly, noticing Thomas through the window. Their eyes met silently, Samuel's calm dignity a powerful reminder to Thomas of quiet strength despite adversity. Walking further, Thomas passed Jefferson High School, where Emily Harris's classroom lights had finally darkened. He thought of her quiet bravery, confronting racism openly despite opposition. He passed Maria Lopez, heading home after another difficult day, their brief nod of greeting reminding Thomas again how deeply prejudice infiltrated their town. In each person he passed, Jessica Ford, quietly fighting to realize her dreams despite obstacles, Joel Baker, silently enduring humiliation at work. Thomas recognized clearly the quiet courage he'd failed to display himself. Returning home, Thomas sat down, determined to face his own complicity. The badge he wore symbolized trust, justice, protection, ideals he had quietly betrayed through silence. Tonight, he resolved not only to acknowledge this uncomfortable truth, but to start quietly challenging it. He knew confronting systemic injustice required more than silent regret. Tomorrow, he promised himself, he would speak openly with Brian, regardless of discomfort or consequences. He would no longer quietly permit prejudice. Though his actions might be small at first, Thomas understood clearly the powerful necessity of breaking the silence he'd hidden behind. Beneath the quiet stars, Thomas felt a profound shift, a silent rebellion forming within him. It was time to reclaim his conscience, quietly but surely. It might not erase the shame of today, but it promised hope for tomorrow. In the quiet darkness of his home, beneath a heavy yet liberating burden, Thomas Reed finally allowed himself the quiet strength to change.